Think about the last disaster that you experienced. Were you prepared? Hi, y'all. I'm Carrie Stevens.
I'm Brett Robertson.
I'm Nancy Carlson.
And I'm Kendall Tish.
And today we're going to share with you our research agenda that talks about specific hazard approaches. Kendall?
The contributions that we can make from this agenda are that when we're communicating about risk, we need to separate mitigation and preparedness and tailor preparedness to meet the needs of specific audiences. And by doing this, we will take and adopt a hazard-specific approach to preparedness. So for example, if we're looking at floods specifically, that would be taking that hazard-specific approach. And the bottom line of why this is important and why it's needed is that Americans aren't prepared for disasters. So countries like Australia are doing a much better job with this. And this makes sense in the context of the US because many of the organizations we have here, such as FEMA, take this all hazards approach to planning and preparing for disasters and in response to disasters. And it's good for response organizations, but for communicating risk, it's hard to communicate to audiences with different needs and different risks and different experiences. So because of this, we developed a model of audience factors that influence flood preparedness, which is guided by theories of that guide our look into preparedness. The key here is that they come from a lot of different disciplines. So disaster studies, health prevention, across disciplines when we think about disaster preparedness and risk. And many of this falls into this risk awareness category. But what we found is that involving the community is really key here when thinking about preparedness and risk. And back over to you, Carrie.
So this leads us to proposition 1, which is we need to separate talking about mitigation from preparedness. And let me use a flood example and talk about economic risks. So when we talk about mitigation with floods, quite often we're telling people that they have to physically raise their home structurally, or they need to purchase flood insurance. Well, those are hard conversations to have because we're getting at people's hard-earned money. And there's a notion of trust there that makes communicating those messages especially difficult. Now, on the other hand, we also have to communicate messages about safety. They're also challenging to get people to prepare those go bags in advance, but they're different conversations. Now what we're talking about is giving people instructions like hide from the wind if you're dealing with a hurricane, which is shelter in place, versus run from the water if you're dealing with an urban flood, and that's more of this evacuation notion. That leads us to proposition 2, which is we've got to tailor these messages because audiences have a bunch of different needs. You just heard me talk about coastal areas and urban flooding. Well, there are different kinds of floods depending on where you live. There are also floods that happen very quickly and we don't have any advance notice, like flash floods, or more slow-moving floods. Possibly it hasn't even rained in your area and you're not going to flood for several days. Once again, lots of different ways that you need to communicate these complicated messages. Nancy's going to share some examples with us.
So there are several locations in Texas that have shifted to a more specific hazard approach communication, such as communities like San Antonio. Many of their community members are Hispanic and speak Spanish. Therefore, creating materials and a mascot named Agua makes sense for their community. A different program is Harris County Thrives, and they have one simple message, and that is everybody needs flood insurance. This makes sense because back in 2017, their community experienced a hurricane. So taking into consideration these different vulnerability indicators is key. Brett?
Our third proposition looks at the role of community as being relevant for preparedness. And what's really important here is to highlight how concepts like community identification, trust among neighbors and police, fire, emergency personnel, as well as a cultural understanding of the community, how that plays a role in preparedness efforts. And while local agencies and organizations may not understand that at a surface level, it's promising when we spend a lot of time investigating what these constructs look like in practice. International research has really supported this idea. Now, in looking at messaging strategies as well too, we've talked about flooding and flooding examples. The main message around flooding in the United States is turn around, don't drown. And our research specifically investigated how that strategy, that message hasn't been systematically evaluated previously. And so we see the opportunity here to really highlight what other countries have done with weather specific approaches, in that these messaging campaigns should be systematically evaluated, relying on theoretical and empirical work to make that claim. Now, we also developed a one-page model in our paper that we'll present here on this slide. If you'd like to look at the model in detail, read the full paper, but for now, we'll just present this slide here for you to take a look at.
So our key recommendations are this. First of all, the literature is scattered across a lot of different disciplines, and we need a lot more focused studies. Australia seems to be leading the way with a lot of their preparedness studies right now. We also need to look at communication campaigns that exist and evaluate them. As we start to use interdisciplinary teams to study preparedness, we need to make sure that we're including science communicators and visual communication experts, because they have the expertise to communicate these really complex ideas to the public. So ultimately, it might not be surprising that we say to take this specific hazards approach to disaster preparedness. And we've shared with you this flooding example, because ultimately we're communication scholars and we tend to like to tailor our messages and know how powerful that can be. So let me end by just asking you, will you be prepared the next time a disaster hits you?